Best wishes to you.
Thanks. Yeah, appreciate it. Thanks. All right, I think we're good. This hearing will come to order. This hearing, titled "The Humanitarian Crisis in Yemen," will examine current political and humanitarian challenges in Yemen and how the United States Congress can address them. Without objection, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length limitation of the rules. I will now make an opening statement, then turn it over to the ranking member for his opening statement. I want to thank our esteemed panel for being here today. I would like to particularly thank Ms. Raja Al-Mutawakkil, for joining us today. She and her organization, Muatana for Human Rights, bravely advocate for justice, accountability, and human rights in Yemen. We're so honored by your presence today. Thank you very much. Having your voice on this panel to help us better understand both the situation on the ground and the plight of the people of Yemen will help us make better and more informed, well-informed decisions. We really are grateful. In September 2014, Houthi rebels attacked the Yemeni capital of Sana'a and forced the internationally recognized government of President Hadi to flee in March of 2015. In response, a military coalition led by Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates launched devastating airstrikes in Yemen and partnered with local forces to reclaim territory from the Houthis. The Saudis and Emiratis remain preoccupied with their military campaign in Yemen, which they view as directly related to their national security, and I share their concern that Iran is providing training as well as military and logistical support to the Houthis. This assistance has allowed the Houthis to attack international shipping, including an American naval vessel, in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. It also empowered the Houthis to launch attacks on territory in both Saudi Arabia and the UAE, where approximately 130,000 Americans live. U.S. relationships with these states are enduring and date to the end of the Second World War. I believe these partnerships are vital to stability in the Middle East. The United States is correct to support these countries' legitimate right to self-defense. However, we cannot avoid the fact that the war has directly caused tens of thousands of civilian deaths in Yemen. The United Nations has verified more than 18,000 civilian casualties since March of 2015, although the actual number is likely much higher. The total does not include the tens of thousands of additional Yemenis who have died from non-military causes, such as disease and hunger, that are worsened by the conflict. Last year's National Defense Authorization Act, the NDAA, required the Trump administration to certify to Congress that Saudi Arabia and the UAE are taking demonstrable actions to reduce harm to civilians and damage to civilian infrastructure in Yemen. However, the administration brazenly ignored the February 9th certification deadline. The administration continues to refuse to certify, ignoring a law supported by both Republicans and Democrats. Even worse, the military conflict has exacerbated a devastating humanitarian crisis in Yemen that began in 2011. According to the United Nations, the crisis in Yemen is the worst humanitarian situation in the world. Approximately 3.3 million people remain displaced, and an estimated 24 million people, nearly 80% of the population, require assistance and protection. More than 20 million people in Yemen are food insecure, with 5 million people on the brink of famine. More than 17.8 million lack access to safe water and sanitation, and 19.7 million lack access to adequate health care. Because of the conflict, poor sanitation and waterborne diseases like cholera are widespread. The World Health Organization estimates that more than 1.1 million people in Yemen have cholera and that thousands have already died from the disease. A lack of humanitarian access in Yemen aggravates these extreme conditions, putting millions at risk of starvation, disease, and death. In response, the United Nations has contributed nearly $700 million in humanitarian aid since fiscal year 2018. In late November, another $131 million in food assistance was announced. The Saudis and Emiratis have provided billions of dollars in assistance, but billions of dollars are meaningless if the goods can't reach those in need, if there's no cold storage for food, if there's no cash available to buy food in places where there might actually be food. Money isn't going to solve the crisis. Only a political solution will end the war in Yemen and begin to relieve the suffering of its people. Like most Americans, I'm deeply troubled by this crisis. That's why I co-sponsored and voted for HJ Res 37, a resolution that requires the removal of U.S. forces from the Saudi-led military campaign in Yemen. I supported the resolution because I believe there is no military solution to this situation. We cannot allow American resources to contribute to, or worse, be complicit in the suffering created by this conflict. Furthermore, with this resolution, Congress is finally engaging in a thoughtful and nuanced debate on our role in foreign policy decisions and the constitutional limits of presidential authority to participate in military action abroad without congressional consent. Congress has an important oversight responsibility when it comes to the use of military force, and we are appropriately reasserting ourselves in these decisions. This afternoon, I hope our witnesses can provide insight into the political situation and humanitarian challenges in Yemen. I also look forward to hearing how the United States government, specifically Congress, can take steps to increase humanitarian access and stem the spread of disease, displacement, and famine. And finally, I hope the witnesses will outline how the United States can support diplomatic efforts to reach a lasting political solution, which is the best way to secure U.S. national interests, end the suffering of Yemen's people, and provide the country with a brighter future. I now turn for the first time in this subcommittee, proudly, to the ranking member for his opening statement.
Chairman, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Chairman Deutsch, first of all, I want to congratulate you on assuming the chairmanship of this important subcommittee. Your leadership on U.S. policy issues in the Middle East is well known, and I look forward to working closely with you and your staff and moving forward. Secondly, I'd like to thank you for calling this important hearing. The ongoing conflict in Yemen has produced the most devastating humanitarian catastrophe in the world. To reaffirm the Chairman's statistics, our concerns are bipartisan. Close to 80% of Yemen's population of nearly 30 million people are currently in need of some form of assistance. That is a staggering 22 million people. 16 million Yemenis lack access to drinking water and sanitation. Another 16 million are classified as severely food insecure. Unfortunately, children have borne the brunt of this humanitarian nightmare. The regional director of the United Nations International Children's Emergency Fund, UNICEF, remarked just last week that, quote, "Today Yemen is the worst place on earth for a child," end of quote. Nearly 85,000 children have died from severe acute malnutrition between 2015 and the end of the last year. About 360,000 children are suffering from acute malnutrition with life-threatening consequences. Cholera has resurfaced in Yemen, with roughly 10,000 suspected cases now reported per week, according to the World Health Organization. Tragically, children account for 30% of the infections. Amid the conflict and humanitarian crisis, Yemen's economy continues to unravel. The exchange rate is around 600 Yemeni rials to the U.S. dollar. As the economy's situation gets increasingly worse, the price of food for Yemenis rises, exacerbating the situation on the ground. We are optimistic that the UN-brokered Stockholm Agreement signed in December 2018 could alleviate some of the humanitarian concerns, but little progress has been achieved since the parties met in Sweden, and violations of the agreement and resulting ceasefire continue unabated. I am saddened by reports that the Iranian-backed Houthi rebels have been targeting and detaining humanitarian workers in the country. International aid is a lifeline to the millions of Yemenis, and humanitarian workers should have unhindered and unimpeded access to civilians in war zones. Everyone should condemn harassment and intimidation of these good people risking their lives to help others. But fundamentally, I agree with the UN Secretary General Guterres' comments last week when he said that we cannot have a humanitarian solution to a humanitarian problem. Only a comprehensive political solution to the conflict can begin to address Yemen's immense problems. Throwing money at the many problems Yemen faces will not fix the country. I appreciate Chairman Deutsch calling this hearing and shedding some light on the tragic humanitarian conditions on the ground currently in Yemen. Too often, we focus exclusively on our nation's more direct security concerns, whether it be al-Qaeda's local branch or the increasing influence of Iran. The truth, however, is that the humanitarian crisis in Yemen is laying the groundwork for future decades of instability in the country that will be inevitably a breeding ground for terrorists to attack the United States. This is a long-term threat to our national security interests and must be addressed. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I look forward to hearing from our esteemed witnesses. I yield back my time.
I thank the ranking member, Mr. Wilson. Ask if any other members, Mr. Malinowski, would like to make a one-minute opening statement. Nope, seeing none. I'd like to introduce the witnesses. Dr. Daphna Rand is Vice President for Policy and Research at Mercy Corps. Prior to joining Mercy Corps, Dr. Rand held a number of leadership positions in government and academia, most recently as the Deputy Assistant Secretary, Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor at the U.S. Department of State. Mr. Malinowski, do you have anything to add to that introduction?
Served ably as my Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Middle East Affairs when I had the honor to work with her at the State Department. And this will not protect you from tough questions today.
Thanks. Also joining us is Radia Al-Amutawakal. She is chair of Watana for Human Rights, a Yemeni human rights organization. Again, we're so grateful for your presence here on the panel with us today. Jeremy Konyndyk is a senior policy fellow at the Center for Global Development. He previously served in the Obama administration from 2013 to 2017 as the director of USAID's Office of U.S. Foreign Disaster Assistance, where he led the U.S. government's response to international disasters. And Catherine Zimmerman is a research fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. To all of our distinguished witnesses, I ask that you limit your testimony to 5 minutes, and without objection, your prepared written statements will be made a part of the record. I thank you again so much for being here with us today. And Dr. Rand, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Deutsch, Ranking Member Wilson, members of this committee. I'm really honored to testify, especially with this expert group of witnesses. In addition to my written statement, I'd like to make 4 additional points quickly. First, I'd like to analyze a bit the humanitarian tragedy and that you have both described so ably. It is clear that institutional and governance solutions are the longer-term complement to the current humanitarian relief operations. There's food in the marketplace, but no money in the household to buy it. 40% of the hospitals are closed or shuttered in Yemen or have been targeted by airstrikes, while 1.2 million people have contracted cholera. Both the public and private sectors have been politicized and in some cases weaponized, with no social safety net, massive inflation, and no regulation on the remaining formal private sector. And the second nuance to the humanitarian situation, we have heard about the prominent strikes on weddings, funerals, and school buses, but there also have been strike upon strike on potato chip factories, agricultural infrastructure, water treatment centers, and electric grids. No party to the conflict is innocent. And the bottom line is this: in Yemen, the military conduct of state and non-state actors has downgraded international norms of warfare. Expectations for how security actors treat civilians, expectations that have held for decades. And I worry that the damage to these international norms will extend far beyond the Arabian Peninsula. The second point is that we are at an inflection. There have been recent agreements regarding de-escalation led by the UN Special Envoy. They have focused rightly on Hodeidah port and city, through which so much of the humanitarian operations transit. And the United States congressional action of last year, your oversight, your legislative activity, your floor statements, these were instrumental in 2018 in creating this diplomatic opportunity. Congressional pressure on this administration dragged the parties to Stockholm, I believe. And although they are limited agreements negotiated by the UN, they have the potential to shift the dynamic. For the first time, Congress has questioned the assumption and the assumed logic that only escalation will achieve the end goals of the coalition, the government of Yemen, or the Houthis. The third point is that, buoyed by recent evidence that your voice matters, Congress should continue signaling privately and publicly that there will be consequences for failing to follow through on the Stockholm agreements. In Yemen, like in so many other places, when Congress speaks united with one voice, You are echoing the conscience as well as the common sense of the global community. So Congress must continue to publicly and privately support the UN Special Envoy process, pushing through to follow through on the current commitments and demand additional de-escalation. Call on the parties directly to empower and improve the functioning of the Central Bank of Yemen in order to control the currency crisis. Tell the government of Yemen and the Houthis to pay the public sector employees, the doctors and the teachers, before the militias. Tell the government of Yemen and the UAE to finally cut through that backlog at the Aden port so that humanitarian shipments can offload there. Tell the Saudis to allow flights out of the Sana'a airport, at least for medical treatment and other basic needs. And finally, and perhaps most fundamentally, call out publicly when U.S. partners and all parties commit human rights abuses in their military operations, whether these abuses are through interrogation or torture, through unlawful airstrikes, or through any other means. And finally, the United States must definitively and completely end its support for the coalition. This is a 4-year policy that has failed. It has incurred significant costs to the United States, generating greater instability and potential new rounds of terrorism in the Arabian Peninsula, offering Iran a broad and chaotic civil conflict to exploit and manipulate. U.S. support for this coalition has had significant moral costs for the United States and for U.S. global leadership worldwide. Congress must ensure that the Trump administration extricates itself from this war. This means legislating a formal end to DoD operations, including the refueling. This means signaling through oversight that the new focus of U.S. power will be on diplomatic opportunities that have arisen. And this means blocking all future offensive arms sales that could be used in the war in Yemen. Finally, and in conclusion, I urge this committee and members of Congress to learn from this failed policy approach of 4 years. There is a dangerous trap lurking when the United States offers a blank check in the form of a security assistance to partners whose values and interests can diverge from ours. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rand. Ms. Almutawakel, thank you again for being with us.
Thank you. Chairman Deutsch, Ranking Member Wilson, Subcommittee members, thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. I will summarize my written statement, which I submit for the record. Muwatana for human rights document violations by all sides in Yemen. It is a dangerous job, but our 70 staff, men and women, know that for humanity to be preserved, the brave must stand up in the face of abuses. Today, I urge Congress to do the same. Congress has the power to change the face of millions of Yemeni civilians, but must choose to do so. 24 million Yemenis need humanitarian aid, more people than live in Florida. 10 million are on the brink of famine, twice South Carolina's population. It is a man-made crisis. Yemenis are not starving, they are being starved. The humanitarian crisis cannot be addressed without addressing the human rights situation. The war in Yemen is not some distant tragedy with no connection to America. Since 2015, the US has supported Saudi and Emirati attacks on Yemeni civilians by selling billions in bombs and other weapons and providing military and political support. After 4 years of war, Yemenis are losing hope for a country based on rule of law. Most now live under de facto control of armed extremist groups. On the one hand, the Houthis, who are supported by Iran, who are also commit terrible abuses, such as indiscriminate attacks, disappearance, and landmines. On the other hand, armed groups loyal to the Hadi government and Saudi Emirati coalition, who also commit horrible violations. All these armed groups act with impunity because they think no one will stand up in the face of their abuses, but neither does Saudi Emirati coalition. When CNN recently showed US weapons sold to Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates in the hands of extremist armed groups, Congress was right to be angry at this recklessness. But you should not have been surprised. Because since 2015, the Saudi and Emirati coalition has used US weapons recklessly to kill and maim Yemeni civilians. Muwatana has documented hundreds of attacks killing and maiming thousands of civilians and destroying key infrastructure. We found U.S. bomb remnants at dozens of these airstrikes. Many are likely war crimes. Every single one destroyed innocent lives. The 2016 Saudi bombing of a Sana'i funeral hall using U.S. munitions, killing and maiming hundreds, should have been a turning point. Congress should have stopped arms sales until unlawful attacks ended and war criminals were held accountable. Instead, the U.S. accepted Saudi and Emirati promises to end violations and investigate. 2 years later, there has been no accountability, and airstrikes on Yemeni civilians continue. Yemen cannot survive another 4 years. In the short time I have been talking to you, another child has died because of war-inflicted wounds, starvation, or disease. Congress has the power to change this, to stop this. Attention to Yemen increased after the outrageous Khashoggi murder. The Stockholm talks showed that the international community can push to end the war. But this tentative progress needs sustained global pressure, including from Congress. Your recent votes in Yemen drove the parties to take small steps toward peace. By ending U.S. arms sales and military support to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, Congress can stop American allies from using American weapons to kill Yemeni civilians with impunity. This would be a significant step toward accountability and an end to the war. This month, America pledged millions in humanitarian aid for Yemen. But if U.S. arms sales to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates continue, American bombs might reach Yemeni civilians before American aid will. Peace in Yemen is very possible, but to achieve it, Congress must act. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Konadek.
Thank you. Chairman Deutsch, Ranking Member Wilson, and distinguished members of the panel, thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today. When this crisis began in 2015, I served as the Director for Foreign Disaster Assistance at USAID, and in that capacity, I oversaw U.S. government humanitarian aid to Yemen for several years, and I also participated actively in U.S. policymaking on the crisis. Since leaving government, I've tracked the crisis closely in my new position at the Center for Global Development. Yemen is the world's worst humanitarian catastrophe, and it is worsening rapidly. Humanitarian relief operations there are robust and they are growing, but aid alone cannot offset state collapse. As you mentioned in your own opening remarks, 20 million people are hungry, 7.4 million are malnourished, at least 238,000 live in areas affected by famine-level conditions. Health and water systems have imploded. 20 million people lack access to adequate health care. Cholera is present, diphtheria is present. Millions have been forced to flee their homes. All parties to this conflict are culpable, but that culpability is not evenly distributed. Any fair assessment must assign predominant responsibility to the Saudi and Emirati-led coalition. To be clear, the Houthis are part of the problem and bear special responsibility for having instigated the conflict. They have blocked and sought to manipulate relief operations, they have harassed humanitarian personnel, and committed a litany of other human rights violations. The Houthis are not angels or good guys by any stretch of the imagination. But while both sides have impeded humanitarian response to the emergency, it is Saudi and Emirati behavior that has been the engine of the emergency. This is because the crisis flows from the collapse of Yemen's economy and its infrastructure, and that has been a direct and seemingly intentional consequence of the coalition's political and military strategy. Their airstrikes have repeatedly and intentionally targeted Yemen's critical infrastructure, directly fostering both Yemen's massive cholera outbreak and its creeping famine. Examples of this include strikes on major ports and roads vital to humanitarian relief and movements, including roads and other facilities that the U.S. government has specifically asked them not to strike. More than 100 attacks on water and electrical facilities, more than 70 attacks on medical facilities, and concerted targeting of food production and commerce, including nearly 600 attacks on farms and 200 attacks on marketplaces. They have also struck weddings, funerals, a packed school bus, and countless other targets with no plausible military purpose. This is not the behavior of a campaign that is seeking to minimize civilian harm. The Saudis and Emiratis have simultaneously pursued a policy of collective economic punishment. Their naval blockade and flight restrictions have disrupted supplies of food, fuel, and other essential goods. The shift of the Yemeni central bank out of Houthi-controlled territory has been a fiasco, depriving huge numbers of Yemenis of their wages and dramatically weakening the currency. For 4 years, the U.S. has treated this kind of reckless behavior as a problem of weak systems rather than malign intent. U.S. officials argue to this day that U.S. military cooperation is a moderating factor. It is time to end this delusion. Saudi Arabia and the UAE have continued to drop U.S.-supplied bombs out of U.S. refueled planes flown by U.S.-trained pilots onto innocent civilians. If this is due to coalition military incompetence, then years of U.S. engagement and support have delivered no improvement. Whereas if this targeting is intentional, then these same U.S. efforts are arguably enabling war crimes. Either way, the Saudis and Emiratis have shown willful disregard for the laws of war and have manifestly failed to demonstrably reduce civilian harm, as Congress demanded rightly last year. U.S. involvement in this confers on us a degree of culpability, but it also gives us unique leverage to change coalition behavior. And one clear takeaway from the last 4 years is that when it comes to moderating Saudi and Emirati behavior, pressure delivers, while quiet engagement does not. To that end, I make 3 recommendations. First, the U.S. should halt all military assistance, including ongoing arms sales and maintenance, that supports offensive military operations in Yemen. This is important leverage and we should use it. Second, the U.S. should put this leverage towards a concerted diplomatic surge. Recent U.S. actions shielding the coalition from Security Council criticism or giving them a pass on Congress's civilian targeting concerns have undermined U.S. goals of halting the fighting and bringing the parties to the table. The U.S. should instead make clear that sustaining the conflict will deal long-term damage to U.S. Saudi and U.S. Emirati bilateral relationships. 2 immediate confidence-building measures would be to negotiate humanitarian access to besieged Tez and to restore neutrality and functionality to the central bank and restart salary payments. Finally, the U.S. should pull out all the stops to protect the Hudaydah ceasefire. A major battle for Hudaydah would devastate the food import lifelines on which most of Yemen depends. The U.S. should make clear to the Saudis and Emiratis that this is a red line. There is much that Congress can do to shape policy in these areas, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Konadike. Ms. Zimmerman.
Chairman Deutsch, Ranking Member Wilson, members of the subcommittee, thank you for your attention to this issue and the opportunity to participate in this hearing. America has vital national security interests in Yemen, defeating al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, reducing Iran's ability to threaten allies in the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, and addressing the deepening humanitarian catastrophe. The U.S. must develop a policy that pursues all of these interests. Above all, America must lead in securing itself and shaping allies and actions to support American interests in accord with international laws and norms. The U.S. must help our partners develop strategies to resolve the underlying conflicts that permit both al-Qaeda and Iran to operate in Yemen, rather than partial and limited approaches that exacerbate those conflicts. The U.S. must also engage diplomatically, not only with the recognized Yemeni government and the United Nations-led peace process, but also with sub-state actors whose views will ultimately determine the durability of any settlement. The U.S. bears some responsibility for the conditions in Yemen. The Obama administration subcontracted Yemen to Gulf partners while pursuing the Iranian nuclear deal. The Trump administration has continued this approach for fear of becoming entangled in Yemen's complexities. American efforts to stay out of the Yemeni mire have helped make the situation worse and reduce the likelihood that our vital national security interests will be secured. Yemen's complexities make finding a solution seem impossible. Trying to simplify it by focusing on one of America's interests to avoid dealing with local conflicts will lead to failure across the board. A U.S. strategy to secure its interests requires dealing with the problem in all of its complexity and abandoning the search for simplistic, short-term, feel-good solutions. If relying on Gulf partners has been counterproductive, abandoning them would be disastrous. They are unlikely to find a way out of this war on their own and will continue it without us. Although limited, American influence has shaped both Saudi and Emirati actions for the better. The U.S. could do even more to shape their behavior if engaged more seriously in the effort. War in Yemen has acquired a momentum that will not easily be stopped. The U.S. must recognize the importance and interest of sub-state actors who benefit from continued conflict and engage them directly and through partners to shape conditions for enduring peace. U.S. policy must recognize that the UN-led effort to resolve the current political crisis may not succeed and will not address the conditions that drove Yemenis to war in the first place. Any elite settlement does not resolve the sub-state actor conflicts, which allows al-Qaeda and Iran to persist, and there is also a gap between what the Houthis and the Saudis will accept in terms of the Houthi representation in the final government. Persuading the Houthis that they will ultimately lose requires a more skillful and nuanced strategy than the coalition has been pursuing, along with much more serious and energetic diplomatic engagements from the United States and extra-regional partners. The Salafi jihadi movement in Yemen has transformed in the context of the war. It's decentralized in such a way that defeating al-Qaeda and the Islamic State will not eliminate the threat. Additional Salafi jihadi groups have established themselves and exist independent of al-Qaeda's support. The current U.S. counterterrorism strategy does not address this transformation. The UAE has been a critical enabler for counterterrorism successes in Yemen, but its efforts are unlikely to yield permanent success. The risk that counterterrorism gains will be reversed is high unless the U.S. helps shape Emirati operations and nest the counterterrorism effort into a larger effort to resolve the underlying drivers. The U.S. should leverage its continued support to this end. The threat from the al-Houthi movement is unacceptable, and it's grown largely through the Iranian support. Iran and Lebanese Hezbollah have transferred asymmetrical attack capabilities that threaten maritime security in U.S. Gulf partners. No clear incentives exist for Iran to stop supporting the Houthis and for the al-Houthis to stop receiving Iranian support. But the Houthis are not Iranian proxies. They are not in the same category as Lebanese Hezbollah, and Yemen is a defensive front for the U.S. in the struggle against Iranian regional malign behavior. Pressure on the Houthis does not harm Iran enough. The humanitarian situation in Yemen has sharply declined over the course of the war, but any emergency humanitarian solution without a political settlement will not be enduring. Long-term international engagement to improve Yemen's weak state institutions and economy will be required for any lasting effect, and low-level conflict will be disruptive. The Trump administration and Congress must prioritize securing a political resolution in Yemen. A first step is for the U.S. to rebuild trust with Yemeni power brokers not close to Riyadh. We might consider moving our embassy into a country other than Saudi Arabia. We must also persuade our partners away from practices that exacerbate the humanitarian crisis. But neither should we defend their practices. We should chastise them publicly when they do wrong and make it clear that our support is conditional. The time to end it has not yet come because we have not yet put enough energy into shaping their actions and giving them a strategy and a way out. America must regain a position of leadership in shaping the coalition's strategies and our own interests inside of Yemen. Real success might not be possible, but it's vital. Thank you for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you very much, Ms. Zimmerman. I'll begin the questioning. There's consensus on the panel that political settlement is what we must be striving for. In December, Martin Griffiths brokered a ceasefire in the Stockholm Agreement between the warring parties. What role should the United States play in diplomacy? How can Congress support those diplomatic efforts springing out of there? Dr. Rand, I'll start with you.
Thanks. The U.S. diplomatic efforts have been behind the scenes, and they've been a bit timid. It is important at this stage that the U.S. State Department step up and both publicly and privately show U.S. leadership and resolve elevating this issue. It has been great. The UN Special Envoy has taken the lead and has been quite successful, but there has been too little effort from Washington to show how important this is to the U.S. government. So I would urge greater public and private diplomacy from the U.S. side.
Ms. Al-Muktawakil, how do the Yemeni people view American involvement in the war?
When we say parties to the conflict, Yemenis consider America as one of the parties to the conflict in a very negative way.
Were they aware of the House's recent passage of the War Powers Resolution?
Whatever happens, although Yemenis have a lot of anger toward America for many reasons. But whenever there's something happening in America, they follow it with a lot of interest because they know what's happening here. It has a lot of influence in Yemen. And for your first question, let me tell you that the peace talk in Sweden, why it happened. It happened only because of the pressure that happened because of the Khashoggi murder. So the international community pressure, especially if the US, in 2 months succeed to send parties to the conflict to the table. So if the pressure continue, it's a balance. It should be a balanced, independent pressure on all parties to the conflict. If this pressure continue, then the peace talk will just continue. And Martin should be supported to be successful in this.
Can I just ask, the work that you do at Moatana for Human Rights, we've heard there are a lot of harrowing statistics that have been thrown around. The numbers are so staggering. But given the data that you collect, can you personalize it for us? Make this the humanitarian crisis, the abuses that you've seen. Can you give it some context from the work that you do through your organization?
So in our work, we work in the details, not in the numbers. So we go deep in the, we just try to move the numbers to details of the suffering of people with just a documentation that can be even a legal paper for the future. We build a human rights memory. So it's a lot, yeah? We are documenting a lot of incidents daily. But I will just mention one of the incidents that was in our late report regarding using US and UK weapons in some of the airstrikes. There was an airstrike in 2018, in April 2018. It was in a wedding in Hajjah, in a very poor area. Most of the people who died in this wedding was the drummers and dancers. And people, they said it was just a very happy day that ended like a judgment day. And those people are marginalized. This picture is not even unique. It's happening. So the past incident is famous, but it's not the only one. The funeral incidents in Sana'a is famous, but it's not the only one. It's not new in Yemen. It's not even strange to sleep as a whole family and then to get up in the morning, one person, and all your family is dead. This is only because of the airstrikes. But airstrike is not the only attacks in Yemen, the only violation in Yemen. It's just only one. What really broke the back of Yemenis is the starvation. It's not having their salaries. And many Yemenis will not go to ask for humanitarian aid because the middle class, they are now very poor, and they are dying behind of the closed doors. That's why humanitarian aid is just an emergency that helps a lot, but will never solve the situation in Yemen. We miss the feeling safe. We're all safe in Yemen by accident, not because we are protected by anything. We miss the feel of being safe and sleeping while we are sure that in the morning all the people we love is going to be safe. It's whatever I said, it's just more.
I appreciate that very much. Thank you so much. And Mr. Wilson, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all of you for being here today. Ms. Zimmerman, given that Iran has not been a party to any of the negotiations or diplomatic initiatives surrounding the conflict, do you assess that Iran has had any incentive to encourage the Houthi rebels to meaningfully come to the negotiating table? If not, how do we incentivize Iran as the major outside supporter of the Houthis to support a peaceful solution to the conflict, including stopping the missile attacks from Yemen on Saudi Arabia?
The issue of whether Iran supports the Houthis going to the negotiating table or not is a little bit moot because Iran doesn't pull the strings in Yemen. It doesn't make the decisions for the Houthi family. There are instances where the foreign minister Javad Zarif has met with Houthis during negotiations, so there's clearly conversations happening backdoor and Iranian advice going forward with the Houthi delegation and negotiating team. But it's not going to be Iranian pressure on the Houthis that changes their actions. They've actually ignored it before, and so I think that's not the vector for changing the Houthi behavior. This is where the nuance in what I pulled forward is actually putting forward a strategy that would convince the Houthis that ultimately they will lose the majority position they hold in Sana'a. That will bring them to the table, and they are there. They just disagree with the Saudis over how much of a share in the government they should hold.
Well, thank you very much. And Ms. Al-Mutawakkil, thank you for your courage to be here. And a question for you, but Mr. Konendijk can add too, because I'm a big fan of USAID, and so it relates to aid. And that is, multiple reports earlier this year indicated the Houthi rebels were engaging in wholesale food aid diversion to key areas they control. How big a problem is this of the Houthi aid diversion? Have the Houthis used the aid diversion to finance their operations in the past? What is the international aid community doing to mitigate this type of phenomenon?
So it's me, yeah?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. It's big. It's very big. We documented many cases where Houthis just obstructed humanitarian access for food and medicine, and also they are bothering humanitarian NGOs in the ground. And humanitarian NGOs cannot talk because Houthis might just do anything. They just might close the humanitarian NGOs, and they don't care. So it's very big. But how to solve it? It's only how to stop the war. Because Houthis is just one issue regarding the humanitarian access, and the Saudi-led coalition is another issue, and the other armed groups are the third issue. So it's a huge problem from all parties to the conflict. But again, humanitarian aid is not a solution in Yemen. It's just a lifeline emergency. So whether we solve it or not, it's not going to solve the problem.
Thanks for that question, Congressman, and thank you for your support for USAID. And I know when I worked there, we really felt the support from the Hill and hugely appreciated it, and I know that they still do. It's a problem. The Houthi diversion is a problem. I think obstruction by both sides is a problem, and that's important to understand. Neither side has their hand clean when it comes to obstructing humanitarian aid. They have different tactics of it. Obviously, it's more on the kind of the entry side with the coalition, and then the ground side with the Houthis. But both sides have been playing games with and obstructing humanitarian aid really from the get-go. My understanding of what has happened since that report on the concerns about food aid diversion by the World Food Program is that, as you'll have seen in the news reports, the World Food Program put out an ultimatum to the Houthis that this behavior needed to change. The Houthis have begun engaging with WFP in dialogue and have begun changing some of their practices that had caused so much concern. I wouldn't say it's completely resolved or perfect, but there is, at least as I understand it, a constructive dialogue going on to address the underlying problems.
Well, you make a difference, and we want to continue that. And Dr. Rand, what is the current status of the Stockholm Agreement and ceasefire?
Unfortunately, Congressman, as of this morning or yesterday, Martin Griffiths, the esteemed and excellent UN Special Envoy, have said it's on life support. He's really trying, and he is disappointed, as we all are. There hasn't been greater commitment by the parties. There's been some redeployment. There has been a diminution in the airstrikes in the Hodeidah city and port, and that was one of the goals, was to decrease the fighting in and around the port. So that has been the best part of the progress, but there hasn't been so far the full redeployment of the forces out of Hodeidah. So that there needs to be pressure right now in the next week or two to ensure that the parties commit to the agreements made in Stockholm.
Well, thank you for your extraordinary current information. Thank you very much.
The gentleman yields back. Mr. Malinowski, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Rand, excuse me, you and I were both involved in the effort to advise the Saudis early in the conflict on how to avoid hitting civilians, on how to conduct their operations in a way that was more consistent with the laws of war and more effective. Could you describe that effort and the lessons that you think we should learn from it?
Sure, thanks. To Katie Zimmerman's point, to your great point, that in the beginning of the war, we at the State Department thought that the best approach was to work with our partners, work with our allies behind closed doors, to build on the strong partnership that the U.S. had with Saudi Arabia. So in 2015, when it was clear that there was these mass casualty civilian target and we assumed that they were mistakes in the fog of war, the U.S. State Department sent a trainer to Riyadh, someone who had worked with CENTCOM on trying to limit civilian casualties for U.S. coalition operations in Afghanistan, thinking that we could train and support the coalition using the same models that had successfully reduced U.S. civilian casualties in Afghanistan. We approached this very technically, behind closed doors, very quietly, sent our trainer in, and he was well received by the Saudi Ministry of Defense. And we kept on trying this, and we were hopeful in the beginning, and we kept on sending him. And then there was a ceasefire in 2016, so we remained hopeful that maybe our efforts to train the Saudis to limit civilian casualties were working. But then in August 2016, when the ceasefire broke down, there was a series of mass casualty civilian targets that were hit in a span of 2 weeks in that deadly August of 2016. And it gave us pause to recalibrate the strategy and wonder what had happened to our training. Where had been the lessons learned that had been taken so receptively by the Saudi Ministry of Defense? And so we continued. We continued. We very quietly resent him. We really, really tried. And we came to the conclusion by late 2016 that although there were very many well-meaning and good and professional generals in the Saudi Ministry of Defense, there was a lack of political will at the top senior levels to reduce the number of civilian casualties. There were many technicians and tacticians who wanted to learn the software and the approaches that the U.S. military had tried in Afghanistan, but at the end of the day, the shots were called from up high, from up above, and there was no political will to change the status quo.
So was it a problem of imprecise targeting, or that they were precisely targeting the wrong things?
Right. It was very clear that precision was not the issue and the guidedness was not the issue. It was the type of target selection that became the clear issue. And even when, as Jeremy has mentioned, the U.S. government told them which targets not to hit, we saw instances where the coalition was targeting the wrong.
So they deliberately struck targets like water treatment facilities, food distribution centers that were on a no-fly list, a no-strike list that was handed to them. Is that correct? And Mr. Kanundak, if you want to chime in as well.
Sure.
Or either of you, yeah.
Yeah, so the basic progression was this. Initially, we provided, so USAID compiled a list of initially just strictly humanitarian sites, so NGO offices, warehouses, things that if you looked at them from the air, you might not be aware it's a humanitarian facility, whereas we would assume you would know what a school looks like, what a hospital looks like, and so on, and not hit those things. What we found was that the Saudis tended to treat anything not on the no-strike list that we gave them as fair game. So then we expanded the list. And we began naming categories of sites, including specific road routes that were critical to the humanitarian effort. And in an instance in, I believe it was 2018, they struck the main bridges along the main road from Hodeidah Port to Sana'a, which was the principal artery for bringing food aid and commercial food into the country. They struck that despite us having specifically told them through that process not to.
Thank you. And Ms. Al-Mutawakkil, first of all, thank you so much for being here and for speaking for people in Yemen whose voices are not normally heard in our debate here in the Congress. When American bombs reach Yemeni civilians before American aid does, as you aptly described the situation, what impact does that have on the Houthis and on other extremist groups like Al-Qaeda? Does it hurt them or does it help them? Do they take advantage of this?
Well, in the war in Yemen in general, the war in Yemen is empowering two groups in Yemen, Qaeda and Iran. So the war is a very perfect environment for all armed groups and their allies, whoever they are. So only rebuilding the state in Yemen can just defeat different armed groups. For Yemenis, many of the Yemenis, they have never been to America, but they received America through the weapons, not through technology, not through education, not through civilization. It's just through weapons. And in many incidents, and we documented in Muwatana 300 incidents since the beginning of the war until today, but not in all incidents we could find remnants of weapons. We could find this in 25 incidents, but it might be even much more. So people, they know America through these weapons, and they feel very angry about it. And it is a propaganda for the Houthis and for the Qaeda. But the situation in general doesn't depend on the propaganda itself. The war, because the war, all parties to the conflict, they don't have a war plan, they don't have a peace plan. And even in the areas that is controlled by Hadi government and the coalition, they didn't try to rebuild the state, the judiciary system, the national army. They decided to empower fanatic religious armed groups in the ground. So this is also empowering Houthis and other armed groups in the areas. If the 80% that was controlled by the coalition and Hadi government was administrated in a good way, then this will defeat also Houthis easily, much easily than the war itself.
Thank you.
Thank you, and I'll recognize Mr. Shabbat for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. As a former chair of the subcommittee and a longtime member of it, it's really heartbreaking to have the need for this hearing today, because this is clearly one of the most significant, if not the most significant, humanitarian crisis on Earth. And unfortunately, it's been extremely frustrating for those of us that are really trying to help and trying to get aid to those people who need it, and try to get a ceasefire on the targeting of civilians, or even if it's collateral damage, so to speak. It's just that's where you really want to have some impact, to be able to not have people who are completely innocent targeted. And or it's always hard, but particularly in this type of situation where you do have the fighters oftentimes in civilian populations. And then another challenge, of course, and I apologize for being in and out. I've had meetings here on and off, and so I've missed, and I probably am repeating some of the things that my colleagues have said. But, and I know, speaking for probably folks on both sides of the aisle, the inability to get the aid to those who need it, the access, is a big problem. So I guess my first question would be, how can we improve that? What could actually work to get the aid to the people who really need it? Is there anything we can do? And I know your organization, USAID, I know that's what you all do, but I'd be happy to just go down the line, Doctor.
I would highlight three things. One is the Sana'a airport is a very important center because of the number of people who cannot leave the country seeking medical help and other treatments. So urging the coalition to open the Sana'a airport. So that would be one. Second, continuing to monitor the verification mechanisms in the Red Sea port. Part of the challenge is there are legitimate concerns about Iranian and other nefarious missile activity in the region. And so the UN has tried very hard to broker a compromise with the coalition to check ships to see, to make sure that there aren't bad things on some of these vessels. But that has really slowed down the humanitarian access into the port. So there has to be more that can be done to ensure that these ships that are coming in with the humanitarian relief are not stopped and blocked, because it's deterring the commercial shipping industry from coming in at all. Yeah. So there can be more work that can be done with the UN and the coalition to ensure that this verification mechanism is not delaying and stopping humanitarian relief access. And then finally, calling attention to parts of the Stockholm agreements that were intended to enable the recovery of the Hodeidah and Red Sea ports along that area. Because of the backlogs at the Aden port, there's no substitute for Hodeidah port. Despite the parties' wish that there could be runarounds, it is still true that 70 or 80% of all humanitarian relief must get into the country through that region and that part of Yemen. And so therefore, that ensuring port capacity, ensuring the management, the administration, and the free flow of goods into that port remains critical.
Thank you. I'm actually, I've only got a minute and 30 seconds to go, so I'm going to hold your thought if I can, because I had one other point I wanted to make. If I go down the line, I'm going to be infringing on other people's time. I was in Yemen some years ago, and in Yemen a number of years ago, and I remember at the time because we got a call. There were only a couple of us on the Codell. It was we got there the day after they blew up the graduation of the police, or it was about 100 people, I think, killed on the parade grounds, and we went in anyway, and and met with an awful lot of good-willed people, but it was, I remember the day specifically because of that. Let me ask this question, Ms. Zimmer. Let me go to you on this one, and I know Mr. Wilson was interested in this as well. The business about human shields. You know, we've heard reports that there are examples where that has happened, where Houthis have embedded, you know, militant fighters or military equipment in civilian areas. Could you address that issue?
Yes, thank you, Congressman. The Houthis and many other of the actors on the ground have used civilian positions, including the offices of international NGOs, as a shield against airstrikes or other artillery fire. And there are multiple instances where you can map the no-strike list against a Houthi military position, and the Houthi military position is right adjacent to a civilian position, which places the coalition in a lot of stress. I think the challenge with civilian casualties in Yemen isn't just limited to targeting from the air, however, and what's missed is the mortar fire that is somewhat indiscriminate in certain places. So in Taiz City, which gets lost in the discussion about Hodeidah because it's not stuck on humanitarian issues, all sides are committing egregious targeting cases, and I think we need to be holding all actors accountable.
Thank you very much. My time's expired, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Shabbat. Mr. Trone.
Thank you, Mrs. Amatukal, for your courage and efforts in this unmitigated tragedy. Food insecurity, lack of sanitation, relocation to the IDP camps, real negative impacts on all the citizens of Yemen. My question is, the women and girls are specifically disadvantaged in this humanitarian crisis and subject to even greater risk, gender-based violence during the conflict. Could you make any comments on protections that we should be taking?
You know, the state in Yemen has collapsed 100%. Before the war, we used to have a shape of state. Now we don't. So you can imagine how much the situation is horrible. Before the war, we were started to discuss to have a law to stop the early marriage. You can now just imagine how much we are way far from this. It's just like a dream. It never happens. And the war is very masculine, yeah? So women were just fighting for many years to be in the front in many jobs in Yemen, and they succeed to have a lot of success in this. And now all of this has destroyed as we are just starting from the scratch. And it's scary how much children, girls and boys, are not going to school now. So I'm just worried about the future of Yemen. Thousands of schools has been destroyed, and millions of children are not going to school. So we are just going very huge steps to the back. Yemen was not that bad before.
Ms. Zimmerman, your thoughts on that?
What?
The challenge that I see is that we're focused on the very serious humanitarian catastrophe right now, which is revolving around the civilian casualties and the distribution of food and fuel, frankly. The challenge that Yemen will face is that it has now gone through 4 years of war, and it's not just coming out of this war, but even from the Arab Spring, children weren't going to school. And so when you look at the Yemeni population, about half of it is under 15 years of age at this moment, and most of them haven't had a regular education. Yemenis already suffered from a high level of illiteracy. It's driving them and setting up their opportunities such that when they come out of this, there will be a significant investment required from the international community to rebuild the institutions to allow Yemenis to start succeeding.
Mr. Konendijk, denial of humanitarian assistance is a violation of international humanitarian law. Under the U.S. Foreign Assistance Act, a government that prohibits or restricts the transport or delivery of U.S. foreign assistance faces penalties, including withholding of foreign assistance and withholding that under the Arms Export Control Act. Based on your observations of the past 4 years, is it your opinion the government of Saudi Arabia and or UAE have prohibited or otherwise restricted foreign assistance?
So on the strict legal question, I'm not a lawyer and I would defer to the lawyers, but I can tell you on the broader policy question, which I engaged with very closely during my several years in the administration, absolutely the Saudis and the Emiratis, principally the Saudis in that case, were obstructing legitimate humanitarian assistance from entering the country. And I think they have given large amounts to the UN, and they deserve some recognition for that, but no amount of aid that they give can keep pace with the damage that they are doing. We saw repeatedly that it was very difficult for humanitarian groups to get aid into the country. And there were instances, for example, in 2015 when ships of World Food Program food were being prevented for weeks on end from being allowed to enter the country. I think what we typically saw was that eventually in that sort of an instance where there was a specific item that they were blocking, they would eventually relent, but only after pretty extensive pressure from the U.S. And that to me is a microcosm of, I think, a key takeaway from this entire process over the last 4 years, which is that when the Saudis are doing something we don't want them to do, or the Emiratis are doing something we don't want them to do, asking them nicely while continuing to sell them arms has not yielded much progress. And the only times we have seen progress has been when, at a very high level, up to and including at times the president himself, when they put that request forward and make clear that it will have consequences for the U.S. Bilateral relationship if it is ignored, then we see movement.
Thank you.
Mr. Reschenthaler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Violence and human rights atrocities, as you know, devastate Yemen. Iran, the world's largest state sponsor of terror, illegally supplies Houthi rebels with missiles, training, and support. These Houthi rebels terrorize civilians and American allies by attacking cities in Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and even civilian aircraft. Yemen also remains a focal point of U.S. counterterrorism. AQAP, Al-Qaeda of the Arabian Peninsula, is one of the largest and most capable terror groups in the region. This is why I voted against the decision to try to remove U.S. forces from the conflict. Frankly, it was dangerous and misguided. And abandoning this region will not end the humanitarian crisis. In fact, it'll just make it worse. Without the United States, bad actors will continue to become more reckless, and the tens of millions of Yemenis will continue to suffer without us. If Syria has shown us anything, it's that rogue countries like Russia and China who have very little regard for peace, prosperity, or even human life, will fill the power vacuum that we create. So, Ms. Zimmerman, can you please elaborate on how the U.S. can better provide security assistance in the Arabian Peninsula while also holding our counterparts accountable for actions that we as Americans wouldn't adhere to?
Thank you, Congressman. I think you've heard today that the U.S. has provided significant tactical training in how to limit civilian casualties and how to improve operations on the battlefield. And you can see that we've done it with Saudi Arabia, and then we've also done that through counterterrorism training with and cooperation with the United Arab Emirates. What has been missing from this piece is the actual strategic guidance and a nuanced approach that will lead our coalition partners to some sort of victory. And so they have applied the tactics that they have learned, not perfectly, against a strategy that is fundamentally flawed. And this is one of the reasons why I think that the U.S. should lean further in and provide what only America can provide, which is the expertise that we have in order to coalesce something that will deliver a better negotiated settlement than frankly what I can see on the table. I still don't see the path from Hodeidah to a national settlement, and that's the key piece that we need to start delivering.
And what are your thoughts on if we continue to withdraw with Russia and China filling that power vacuum? Do you want to elaborate on that?
Saudi Arabia and the UAE are one of the few partners we have that don't need our money. And if we were to stop selling munitions and weapons, the question is then, will they keep buying it? And I think the answer is yes. And when we provide it, we also provide it with significant support in terms of military training. It has not been completed in terms of our military training and the professional development, especially of the Saudi military. And withdrawing the provision of weapons will probably lead to the end of that sort of training, which means that we've gotten halfway there, and then we lose that investment. Russia and China don't have that sort of predilection in terms of who they sell their weapons to and the end use of the weapon. And so we've seen cases where our partners have not used our weapons as we've desired. We should publicly hold them accountable. But we also need to recognize that at the end of the day, there are other actors out there with weapons that are high-end and they're willing to sell as well.
Thanks, Ms. Zimmerman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Rissenthaler. Mr. Vargas, you're recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you again, the witnesses, for being here today. Obviously, it's a hugely tragic humanitarian crisis. I've also had the opportunity to talk to David Beasley, former governor from South Carolina, who tells me of the issues they've had at the port, and so I want to talk a little bit about that. Has the issues of the food coming in, I mean, I understood you saying that there could be some contraband on the ships, and that because of that they've stopped them, and maybe there's a lot more hassle, if you will, to get in. Has that been corrected, or how can that be corrected? I know that that isn't the whole issue because there's just so many people that are on the point of starvation, but it does seem that so much of it, you said 80 to 90% of the food goes through there. How is that being corrected? Who would like to handle that? Go ahead.
I can take a first crack at that, and I'm sure others have thoughts. So when I was at AID, this was one of our major preoccupations, protecting that lifeline through Hudaydah, because it is where most of the country's food comes. And we saw two important dynamics that were concerning. One was obviously the Saudi naval blockade, which was preventing a lot of legitimate material from getting in out of fear, as you said, that there may be contraband upon some of the ships. We also saw Iran playing games. And Iran at one point sent what they called an aid ship, and I think that ship probably did only have aid on it, but there was no way to know that. And they were doing that to test the Saudi blockade, and they were in effect misusing aid as well. So we did two things. First, we worked with the UN to set up an arrangement where all aid from Iran and other states would go through the UN and be validated by them and delivered by them rather than directly by the state. So that ensured that the contents of the aid were legitimate and not being, no contraband was on board. And then we set up something called the UN verification and inspection mechanism for all commercial shipping. So kind of a counterpart for commercial to what existed for the aid. And that was a UN process for similarly verifying and validating what was on board ships to avoid contraband. The concern has been that the Saudis and Emiratis have not been great about respecting and working through UNVIM. And I think that gets to the underlying issue, which is that the purpose of the blockade is not merely to prevent contraband; it's also to economically hurt the country with cover of this contraband argument.
So that was going to be my question, because there's, it seems that there is the whole issue of, the contraband, but more than that, they were using it almost as a way to starve the country.
It was an excuse.
It was an excuse. Okay, and has that been corrected at all? I mean, what can we do to change that reality again?
It has not. It is a problem that requires constant management. Others may want to weigh in.
I would
Yes.
just add that I think these two questions actually relate to each other. Congressman, your question assumed a bit of a binary between either withdrawing completely from our relationship with Saudi Arabia and stopping to limit U.S. support for the coalition for the war in Yemen. The United States is actively engaged to support the defense of Saudi Arabia day in and day out, aside from operational DoD and arms sales support for the war in Yemen. And this is a great example. Right, the United States will and continue to defend Saudi Arabia from contraband material going through the Red Sea port, through the activities that my colleague just described, and many, many other naval and maritime activities.
I'm going to reclaim my time because you're actually not focusing on my question. My question was not about Saudi Arabia. They're doing quite fine. My question was more about Yemen and how are we going to help the Yemenis people. So again, I want to focus, how can we get more food in there? I know one of the things that we can do also is try to figure out how to help their currency. I mean, their currency in free fall creates a real problem when there is, in fact, imported food that people would be able to buy if it wasn't for the depreciation of their currency.
This is not only your question. I've heard this question from more than one. How can we just help the humanitarian access? We are in the Congress, and it's just so weird for me to ask this question rather than asking how can we stop the war in Yemen. humanitarian access is a very small issue in Yemen. And it's not even the only thing that's caused starvation in Yemen. For example, millions of Yemenis are not receiving their salaries for years now, those who are living under the control of Houthis, which is most of the population of Yemen. Houthis, they don't consider themselves responsible to pay salaries, and the Hadi government, the coalition, were not paying salaries for people just because they are living in the areas that is controlled by Houthis. That's one of the main reasons that causes starvation in Yemen, more than the access of humanitarian aid. So the issue in Yemen is not an issue of how to flow the humanitarian access. It's much more than this. And if there is a humanitarian crisis here, and you have a very big influence to stop the crisis, it's just like this symbol. That to stop it to stop the war, not just to solve the problem of how to get the food in. Humanitarian NGOs can solve this problem. And they are trying to, it's not your question, it's a
No, I know
question
my
that-
time has expired. I just wanted to,
Yeah.
but thank you for your answer. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Vargas. Mr. Sherman, you're recognized.
If our goal was just to feel better and more moral, we would get ourselves completely out of Yemen in all respects. It is unlikely that Yemen will be a place that anyone says that's where great things are happening, and America's a great country to be a part of that. But the fact is that washing our hands of the issue does not necessarily the best thing we could do for the Yemeni people. I know that air power has been criticized here. I point out, as the country that has the leading air power in the world, we should defend the rules of engagement and the laws of war, which make it plain that if you're hitting strategic targets for strategic reasons, and in that context, that you are trying to avoid civilian casualties, that is legal. If we then take the position that you cannot use air power if you have any adverse effect on civilians, then air power is illegal, and it puts us in a much worse strategic position. One way this war could end is we could change sides or whatever and join the Houthi. And how bad would the Houthi be if they just took over the country? They have a record of enforced disappearances to children soldiers. The UN has said they've committed war crimes, but if they, Dr. Rand, if the Houthis just swept their opponents from the battlefield, would they engage in reprisals? Would they kill civilians? Or I don't expect them to provide good governance, but would the people of Yemen be better if 6 months from now the Houthi just controlled the whole country?
Thanks, Congressman. The Houthis do control around 75–80% of the population, so this is not a hypothetical.
Right.
This is
Well, it is in some ways.
Yeah.
They may be holding themselves back, saying we want to restrain ourselves and not kill 50, 100,000 civilians until we win the war. Then once we win the war, then we don't have to worry as much about our world image, and then we can kill our enemies. Lenin didn't kill all his enemies in 1917. He waited till more like 2025. So if the Houthis really had freedom of action, what would they do?
I want to invite you to visit Muwatana's website just to see how much Houthis are already killing civilians. They are not holding themselves back. They are engaged in many serious violations, indiscriminate shelling, child soldiers, torture, enforced disappearance, a lot. They are doing whatever they can do in the areas that they are controlling. But who said that the scenario of stopping the war, that the Houthis control the areas? How this idea came up? So the idea of for the political agreement is to just end, to just replace all armed groups to a state, the state of rule of
Well,
law.
obviously, if we can create peace and compromise, that's the best possible outcome. But we've been trying to do that for a long time. I'll ask the panel, how optimistic are you that a peaceful solution will be reached among the parties?
Congressman, in 2015 and in 2016, the U.S. government was focused very, very directly on reaching a ceasefire in Yemen. And
Right.
to be honest, in the past 2 years, that has not been a focus of U.S. foreign policy. So what we are advocating here is elevating this issue as a diplomatic priority, given the momentum in Sweden, and pushing the Trump administration to really make compromise and political negotiation the end goal, as opposed to some of the parties' maybe preferred strategy of escalation. So that's the recommendation here.
And Congressman, I think, just to hit on a couple of your other points, I don't think anyone is advocating for the U.S. pulling out or for the Houthis winning or just...
Well, when you say pulling out, nobody's advocating for us to pull out diplomatically.
Yeah.
And in fact, there's a consensus on the panel that we should have a higher level diplomat involved in these issues. But there's a lot of folks urging us to pull out militarily.
Yes, including me. And the reason for that is, in your comment, you said, would this have implications for U.S. use of air power? I think if the Saudis were anywhere close to the quality of targeting and the quality of respect for international law of armed conflict that the U.S. military is, there would be far less of a problem.
We're doing a much better job now. If you compare what the Saudis are doing to our approach in World War II, I don't know how historians would rate us, but I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Liu, you're recognized.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman George, for calling this hearing on Yemen, and I appreciate your doing so. And the message we're sending is that we're not going to let this issue go. So if you're Saudi Arabia or UAE or the Trump administration, we're going to keep highlighting it. We're going to keep exposing your war crimes and the famine that you're causing in Yemen. I do note that, as the witnesses had testified, a new report recently came out with nearly 1,000 people killed by U.S. munitions and over 120 children killed. I do have a question about that report. So, Ms. Elma Tukwakel, was that from airstrikes from the Saudi-led coalition that did not also include airstrikes from, let's say, civilian drones and others with U.S. intel? What was the nature of that casualty count?
No, these ones, we have reports about drones, and there are incidents regarding the drones, and there's civilians who has been killed and injured because of drones in 2017 and 2018.
Is that in your report, or that's a separate report?
No, it's separate. This one, in this report, it's only the Saudi and Emirati airstrikes.
Thank you. And are you aware of any Saudi or UAE officials being held accountable for the killing of civilians through these airstrikes?
This is a dream.
Okay, so the answer is no. And as you had testified earlier, and as Congressman Malinowski had noted, it appears that many of these airstrikes are not because they're trying to hit a moving Houthi target and missed. It's that they are deliberately trying to target the actual places to hit that have lots of civilians. Is that correct?
What's really strange about the incidents that killed and injured civilians in Yemen, it's very preventable. Many of the cases what we have documented, there is no even a military target. People themselves were asking why we were targeted. It is even strange. That's why it's not a matter of training, it's a matter of accountability. They don't care. If they care, they can just make it much better, at least not to embarrass their allies.
Right. Thank you. I actually think it's worse than that they don't care. It does appear to me that they are intentionally hitting civilians. So as you know, during the Obama administration, Saudi jets flew and hit a funeral that had a lot of civilians, injuring, killing hundreds, and then they came back around and struck the very same precise location again. So my view is they're deliberately targeting civilians. I think these are war crimes. And my question to Dr. Rand is, when you have civilians in Yemen watching a U.S.-supported coalition killing a lot of civilians. Wouldn't that fuel what terrorists are trying to do in recruiting members and causing more people to hate the United States, as well as the British, who are also providing these munitions?
Will you turn on your
Sorry,
microphone,
yep,
please?
thank
Mr.
you.
Dr.
Thank you, Congressman. As my colleague has said earlier in the hearing, I think if you're sitting in Yemen, none of the outside powers look appealing at this point, and I think there's a lot of blaming that's going on. But yes, this is so directly and obviously a recruiting vehicle for radicalism, extremism, and the next generation of AQAP in Yemen. And behind every sortie is clearly the image of a U.S.-sold weapon, a U.S.-sold airplane, and the maintenance and the other support services. So there's no doubt there is a real risk here of generating greater terrorist threat in Yemen of the like of AQAP or a future generation of radicalization.
And then this is a question for anyone on the panel. It was reported today that the Trump administration is reversing an executive order that would essentially now hide the number of civilian deaths being caused from drone strikes from our intelligence agencies. How many of you think that's a good idea? Okay, no one does. So what's your view of what the harm would be if we hide that information from Congress and the American people?
I'm sure my colleagues have ideas of responses as well, but just in brief, the idea of the 2016 executive order was in keeping with democratic principles of transparency and clear communication to be open about the civilian casualties in line with current operational procedure at DoD. That was the goal of the 2016 policy, and revoking it sends a signal to the American public and to, more importantly, probably allies, friends, and enemies around the world that the United States will be hiding its civilian casualty. I would also say this is a global executive order. It's not related to Yemen, but it's related to today's hearing because one of the original purposes of the 2016 executive order was to send the signal to U.S. allies of how America handles its own civilian casualties in wartime operation, to send the signal that the U.S. is open, the U.S. is transparent, the U.S. is willing to investigate ourselves, which was what we were urging the coalition to do and continue to urge it. So there was a diplomatic value to this executive order in 2016, and revoking it is stepping back and saying that we are not going to expect allies and partners of the United States to adhere to the same standards of accountability of the U.S. military.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Liu. This was an excellent hearing. I'm really grateful to all of the witnesses. Yemen is a humanitarian crisis, and American leadership is necessary to ensure food is delivered and that we stop the spread of the disease. But ultimately, a political solution is necessary to end the war, and American leverage is what can be used to help accomplish that. Again, I thank the witnesses. Ms. Amotawakal, your voice here with us today is so critically important to our decision-making going forward. I would just ask that as you return to Yemen, that you make sure that you take with you the commitment by this committee and by this Congress to continue to focus on the crisis in Yemen and the war and work to see that it ends. And with that, this committee is adjourned.
Final comments were terrific.
Oh, thanks. Thanks. This was great.